The snow fell in long, deliberate strokes, painting the world in silence. It was the kind of night that made your bones ache even before the cold reached them, and the town had emptied itself of all but the wind and the stubborn shadows that clung to the edges of buildings. In the center of Main Street, Willa Gray Elk stood alone, her dark hair flecked with snow, hands pressed tight against her chest beneath a threadbare coat. She had walked these streets many times, always feeling the weight of eyes that would not meet hers, voices that whispered as she passed, and the unspoken verdict of a society unwilling to embrace her presence. Yet she walked steadily, each step measured, each breath a quiet testament to endurance. The town's whispers were sharp in their absence. Doors closed silently as she passed. A child was hurried indoors by a mother's anxious hand. Willa did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze entirely. There was a dignity in her stance, a quiet insistence that the snow around her would not define her worth. But even in this resolute composure, there was an ache, a subtle tremor of loneliness that clung as stubbornly as frost to the shutters. She had learned to survive invisibility, yet survival alone had grown thin on her spirit. From the far edge of town came the rhythmic sound of hooves on frozen ground. Elias Crow emerged from the shadows of the forest, the lantern on his saddle casting brief golden patches across the snow. The man was a familiar figure in these parts, tall, angular, and unyielding as the pines behind him. Townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones, a man shaped by solitude, by winters that had taught him silence, by losses he carried like invisible scars. He was the kind of man who warned strangers away with a single glance, who had grown so accustomed to the cold of the world that he no longer sought warmth from it. "You'll die out here," he called, voice low but carrying, cutting through the hush of the falling snow. It was not meant as cruelty, though it landed with a sting of certainty. It was a statement shaped by experience, by nights when the wind had claimed more than he could save. His eyes, sharp as icicles, scanned the figure before him, wary but unwilling to turn away. Willa's breath misted in the cold air. She met his gaze, steady, unafraid. There was a quiet recklessness in her choice, the kind born not of ignorance, but of a stubborn understanding that sometimes survival meant trusting even when reason warned against it. She did not speak. Her silence carried a weight, a challenge wrapped in humility. Elias studied her, noting the firmness of her shoulders, the careful steadiness of her steps. For a moment, he considered turning back, leaving her to the snow and the night, but something in the way she held herself drew him forward, compelled him to linger in the presence of someone unclaimed. The snow thickened, settling over rooftops and roads in a muffled, crystalline hush. Wind gusted across the street, brushing Willa's hair across her face. She brushed it away with a gloved hand, careful not to meet Elias's eyes, and began walking toward the forest trail that led beyond the town's reach. Elias did not move immediately. He watched her for a heartbeat longer, then lifted himself onto his horse, hooves crunching over hardened snow, and followed at a measured distance. His presence was both a warning and a promise, a man who would observe, who might intervene, but who demanded vigilance, who demanded trust without words. The path narrowed, winding between frost-laden pines. Shadows stretched long and silent. Willa's boots pressed into snow that threatened to swallow them with every step. The forest was alive with the whisper of ice against bark, the occasional snap of a brittle branch under the weight of the storm. Elias rode alongside her, careful not to crowd her space, yet close enough that she could hear the soft scrape of his leather reins, the faint rhythm of his breathing. Each glance they exchanged was a study of restraint, a dialogue composed of posture, of motion, of careful attention rather than spoken language. They passed a frozen stream where the water struggled beneath its icy shell. Willa paused for a moment, toes brushing the crusted surface, and inhaled deeply. The scent of pine and snow was sharp and clean, yet tinged with a faint, metallic promise of winter storms. Elias watched her, noting the way her fingers flexed against the cold, the subtle tension in her frame that betrayed alertness and weariness at once. It occurred to him fleetingly that this woman had lived her life in vigilance, had been made to stand alone when others would have reached for her hand. A stumble. Willa's foot caught on an unseen root beneath the snow. She faltered, and instinct carried her into Elias's side before gravity claimed her. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow, firm and controlled, not lingering longer than necessary. There was no gratitude spoken, no breathless exclamation, only a brief nod, an acknowledgement that this was not charity. It was survival, shared silently between two people who understood the fragile balance of life in the wilderness. They moved on, the forest gradually thinning, revealing a clearing where a small cabin crouched under the weight of snow, smoke curling from its chimney in a thin, tentative ribbon. Elias dismounted first, the crunch of boots on crusted snow echoing in the stillness. Willa followed, careful now to keep her pace steady, to maintain the rhythm they had established. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dust, of winters endured and nights spent in solitary vigilance. Elias stoked the hearth, sending sparks of amber into the dim light, warming both the room and the air around them. Willa shed the frost from her coat and hair, moving silently to the small, worn rug before the fire. They did not speak at first. The fire crackled, filling the quiet with sound. Elias's eyes lingered on her, noting the resilience etched into her posture, the quiet courage that had carried her through town, through the night, through his initial warnings. Willa watched the flames dance, the warmth seeping into her frozen limbs, her thoughts tracing the contours of a trust she had not expected to offer, and yet had found herself giving with each step into the forest. Night stretched on, the storm outside relentless but softened by the walls around them. They shared the cabin's warmth not with words, but with proximity, with the careful attention each gave the other's comfort. Elias tended the fire with quiet deliberation, Willa folding the blanket she had carried with her into a neat square, placing it over a chair. Small gestures, subtle, considered, deliberate, became their language. In the absence of conversation, intimacy grew. By dawn, the wind had shifted, softened. Snow still fell, but the world felt lighter, as if the storm had delivered them both to a place of reprieve. Willa rose first, brushing the frost from her hair and covering Elias's shoulders with the blanket as he slept, an instinctive act of care. He stirred at her touch, eyes opening to meet hers, a brief smile touching the corners of his mouth before it faded into thoughtful quiet. The first rays of sun touched the snow, igniting crystals like distant stars scattered across the white expanse. Outside, the forest waited in patient silence, but inside, two souls had begun the quiet work of connection, each carrying the other through a night that had demanded courage, trust, and the willingness to walk alongside another in vulnerability. The cabin, small and isolated, had become a sanctuary, not just from a storm, but from the ghosts of loneliness they had carried alone for far too long. It was a beginning that promised nothing and everything all at once. The snow would continue to fall, the wind would continue to test them, and the world beyond the clearing would continue its judgments and its whispers. Yet within the warmth of that small cabin, within the fragile threads of trust and careful attention woven between them, something new had taken root, something that could endure, something that might one day become the life each had quietly been seeking, a life defined not by fear or judgment, but by the courage to walk into the cold together. And as the morning light settled across the snow, Willa and Elias knew, without words, that this night had changed them both. They had survived not only the storm, but the isolation, and in the quiet, in the trust born of shared endurance, they had found the first hint of something lasting. The story of their lives was no longer written in solitude. It had begun to be written in the delicate, deliberate steps taken together through the cold, through the night, toward a future neither could yet see, but both would now face side by side.